Welcome to our monthly online seminar organized by PoSoCoMeS. The Post-Socialist and Comparative Memory Studies Working Group is part of the Memory Studies Association. Our group's mission is to bring together scholars working on memory in post-socialist world and promote a dialogue between those studying different national contexts and coming from different disciplines. It includes comparative and transnational approaches. Our monthly seminars usually take place on the first Monday of the month. This month is the second because it's the beginning of the year. And if you have any ideas for future seminars, please contact us. And today we will have a discussion around the book authored by Daniela Koleva, Memory and Justice, Personal Reminiscences and Public Narratives of Communism, which was published in 2020 in Bulgarian language. The book explores the memory of the communist past, the official memory established by state institutions, the public memory shaped by media, memorials and commemorations, and the everyday vernacular memory of individuals, families, local and generational communities. The broad question the author seeks to answer is how the recent past is remembered and which circumstances conditions this remembrance. Our guest, the author of the book is our guest today. Daniela Koleva is a professor of oral history and memory studies at the Department of History and Theory of Culture at Sofia University. Her research interests are in the fields of oral history, social history, and anthropology of socialism and post-socialism, biographical and cultural memory, politics of memory and heritage, gender and social constructivism. She has published a monograph on the normal life course in communist Bulgaria and a number of book chapters and articles in peer-reviewed journals. Her interest in the everyday life and life course under communism has resulted in a series of edited volumes, one of them, International Negotiating Normality, Everyday Lives in Socialist Institutions. She is a co-editor of 20 years after the collapse of communism, expectations, achievements, and disillusions of 1989, and many other books. She has recently embarked on a new project on the transnational entanglements of Cold War medicine and healthcare, supported by the ERC Synergy program. And our discussant for today will be Nikolai Vukov. And he is the associate professor at the Institute of Ethnology and Folklore Studies with Ethnographic Museum and at the Bulgarian Academy of Sciences, and visiting lecturer in cultural history and social anthropology at Sofia University. He has a PhD in anthropology and folklore studies and in modern history. Nikolai Vukov has specialized in a number of universities and research centers in Berlin, in Paris, Istanbul, Sofia, Bucharest. His scholarly interests are related to the anthropology of memory and commemorations, 20th century European history, communist and post-communist studies, monuments, public rituals, and museum representations. He is the author of and co-author of several monographs and of more than 120 articles and studies in edited volumes and journals in Bulgaria and abroad. His most recent research is dedicated to borders and border guarding in communist Bulgaria. And today, Nikolai first will speak, will provide our review of the book, and questions to our author, and then it will be Daniela's turn to answer these, and after that we will have a discussion with the audience. And we'll have around an hour and a half or longer if we want to stay longer for that. So now, Nikolai, it is your turn. Welcome, everyone.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Anna. Thank you for the invitation to sit up as a discussant on this workshop meeting. Dear colleagues, it's my great pleasure and privilege to act as a discussant and to introduce this latest book by Daniela Koleva, Memory and Justice, Personal Memories and Public Narratives about Communism. The book was published a bit more than a year ago in Bulgarian within a series of the Institute of the Study of the Recent Past in Sofia and Cielo Publishing House. And it has been really unexpected and awaited book, prepared by a range of publications by Daniela Koleva over the years on various issues related to oral history and public memory of the communist period in Bulgaria and Eastern Europe. It has been prepared as part of this series of the Institute of the Recent, of the Study of the Recent Past. It has been prepared by the publications within the series dedicated to a multitude of topics and issues during communism in Bulgaria, on economic and social history, historiography and debates about the meaning of the communist past, on educational policies, atheistic propaganda, agricultural development, tourism, etc., to name just a few of these works. And among them, within this series, the attention to the memory and oral history testimonies about the past has held special place and has kept a resonating appearance over the years. And this book has been prepared also by numerous projects that Daniela Koleva has held and led over the years on, to name again just a few, on Belene, the camp on the island of Belene during communist period, on the village of Iskar, on life stories of different generations living during communist times and after 1989, on existential policies during communism, a long-term project at the Center for Advanced Studies in Sofia, etc. And over the years, indeed, there has been really a steady appearance of publications, books, articles, and studies on these topics. And they formed a significant corpus of research and interpretative insights to the deeper and more thorough exploration on the topic of communism and the memory about the communist period in Bulgaria. And as you well know, and many of you have had the chance to see yourselves and to enjoy the pleasure of getting in discussions and communication with Daniela Koleva. This work, this book has been also prepared by a series of papers and reports at international conferences and workshops. And some preliminary ideas and preliminary work on it is accessible in a range of articles, journals, and edited volume. It has been prepared also by the participation of network of colleagues and students and collaborators devoted to the collecting of oral testimonies about the communist times and reconstructing the life worlds of witnesses about these times. It has been a long-term involvement and interaction and really an inspiring collaboration with a range of colleagues from Bulgaria and abroad. And as a result of all this continuous work, this has been developed a rich archival database of oral testimonies, hundreds of biographical interviews with people from different towns and villages with different professions, different political stances to the period, different memories and different cases of forgetting, revisiting, reassessing those times. Indeed, as I already emphasized several times, it has been an awaited book, a synthesis of at least 2 decades of intense and inspired work, um, contagious, if I may use this term in this present day circumstances, contagious with enthusiasm for many scholars and researchers from Bulgaria and abroad. And it is a very complex text, dense with empirical materials, with a multitude of angles and levels of interpretation, with a solid grasp of existing, as you know, really proliferating literature on memory, transitional justice, trauma, nostalgia, and cases of revisiting the communist period. It will be certainly possible to present in a nutshell the book, but let me start with touching upon several of the major points that are addressed and how to say, as a act as a skeleton, as a grounding surface of the book. The first one is the point about the divisive memory of communism. Divisions that go along different generations, different witnesses, different political positions, divisions between allergy to the period, disclaim of the period, and nostalgia about the period. Trauma and revisionism, disclaim and entertainment. The second one, the second point, which I will further on develop, but now just initially raising them forth to your attention. And this is a point that the book in a way struggles with and argues for legitimacy with, the enhancing distance to the communist period and the gradually vanishing, disappearing points of reference to this period. We still continue to call this past a recent past, no matter that it's 32 years after the changes, no matter that a vast, large number of the witnesses are no longer among us, that the plane of forgetting has, in many respects, overwhelmed and surmounted the plane of remembering. At the same time, it is a point, the point of the recent past gives a unique moment of still being able to find witnesses, and it's among the last occasions that we have as anthropologists, as historians of the present, we have this chance, and it is richly utilized in the book, of interacting with witnesses, of extracting or collecting testimonies, and doing our work of comparing and analyzing these interventions. Another major point, which is already from the start of the book itself, it's offered to the reader and remains as in a way, a dilemma until the very last pages of the book, is the relationship between public memory and private recollections, between personal stories and official narratives. This constant switching in between the official and the private, the narrowly personal and the overtly public angles of adjusting the interpretation about the communist period and the memory about it. This dilemma runs across the entire book and poses a series of questions by itself about the borders, the lines that divide the public from the private, the lines that divide the personal experience and the official discourses that very often do not, and most often overtly and intentionally do not rely and avoid and exclude the personal input. And related to this, the relationship between the oral and the written, the narrated and the documented. These collisions between the constant changes in memory and the fixation of the documented page, the steadiness and the strict lines of the documented and published, in some cases, account. In any case, the leading dilemma and the leading point, the key problem of the book is the relationship between memory and justice, between the honor and dignity of remembering and the duty of establishing, imposing justice about crimes, about cases of perpetration, about persecutions, etc. And this problem goes through any of the aspects, all the aspects that are aspects of the problem that the book deals with. And it's a recurrent theme in all the different parts and chapters of the book. It is a book in Bulgarian, which makes it a bit less accessible to international audience. So let me, I will do it really very briefly in a sketch, in an outline, briefly present the different parts of the book before asking the questions to the author, so that to give you a brief synopsis of the main parts and the main arguments. It starts with examples based on the different communities of mourners and communities of commemoration on occasions of the day of the socialist victory, 9th of September, and other days of within the communist sacred calendar before the changes of 1989, and raises, starting from these different communities of remembrance, which are communities that do not even interact in between, or no matter that their memories and their commemorative stances are so different and so colliding. The book opens this discussion about the divisions, about the difficulties of narrating and the difficulties of communicating memory, and makes a really impressive methodological overview, theoretical overview and methodological account of possibilities of dealing with memory, of asking questions about the limits and possibilities of collective memory and who actually remembers traumatic or not only traumatic past, raises questions about the sites of memory and their changes over the over time, and their vulnerability to political reinscription and reinterpretation. And in the context of truly dense grasp and discussion of theoretical works on memory and commemoration, opens the discussion about collective and collective memory, communicative memory, cultural memory, and the policies of memory with regards to the communist period, where the difficulties of not only of remembering, but also of putting memories into narratives, and the possibilities of fighting and of finding presence of the little narratives and the little stories within the large narratives before and after 1989 has been one of the most serious challenges yet until today. In the first part, which is politics of memory and cultures of memory, there has been dedicated several 3 chapters to different aspects of this big story, big narrative about the past, this new narrative that had to be construed after the end of the communist period, and that had to provide grounds for coping with the past. And here is one of the major contributions of the book, positioning the memory of communism within the policies of memory on the European Europe-wide scale of memory processes, and particularly relating and discussing the differences and planes of comparison with the memory of the Holocaust and other tragic, traumatic events in European history. In chapter 3, yet again, there comes the point this major theme about the policies of justice, the retributive justice, and all these major attempts in East European societies, not only in Bulgaria, but in different countries of Eastern Europe, to find legislative grounds, to develop legislative grounds about the crimes committed during the communist regime, to find legislative terms to reach at providing justice and retributions or rehabilitation of the victims, to search for a responsibility on behalf of the perpetrators, and to navigate in all this complex ground between, on the one side, the legislative sphere, and on the other side, the ethical and the moral sphere, and navigating through these different seas to reach very often in most of these societies of Eastern Europe, despite the fact that in many of them, a series of legislative acts and laws have been promoted and exist until today, despite all this, to reach a situation where there is still many more to be asked for, and many disappointments and needs of further developments into the legal and to the moral sphere needs to take place. Chapter 4, within the first major part, is dedicated to the policies of acknowledgement, and it starts with the point of this archival revolution in Eastern Europe, where finding grounds for truth, or discovering the truth, establishing the fact, is considered and is legitimately so a very important precondition for the acknowledgement of the suffering, and for achieving certain levels of appeasement and certain level of negotiating the stories about trauma in the past with the victims as well as with the perpetrators. This is a chapter which deals with the efforts in different East European societies of developing a new historical narrative about the communist period, developing institutions of memory, and forming, making the first steps of creating cultures of memory through examples of memorializations and museumization in the different countries, states of the region. This chapter yet again very openly discusses the possibilities of the memory of the victims to get into the public space, to have its presence into the public, and to be a point of embracement by the public discourse, so that not to remain only within the confines of the family and individual and strictly personal sphere. The second major part is dedicated to mnemonic narratives and communities of memory, touching or not touching, but taking up again the theme with which the overall book started, about these divisions along memorial lines within Bulgarian society. And here very much dwelling into oral history interviews and data collected in the course of these years of research work. Daniela Koleva develops separate chapters dedicated on the one side on trauma and traumatic narratives, and on the other side a separate chapter, chapter 6, on nostalgic narratives, stories which are so much overridden with nostalgic potential. In both of these chapters, there is an impressive historical archaeology of the processes and intellectual history of dealing with trauma and dealing with nostalgia. The contours and the backgrounds of trauma and nostalgia as cornerstones that have predated the communist period, but that have found its momentum in many respects after the end of the communist regime, and by, as she very legitimately claims, it has in the part related to museums of the communist period, this has been really a very a strong input that societies of Eastern Europe gave to the landscapes of memory by creating on completely new terms museums of the repressive regimes. Museums of repressions, museums of persecution, occupation, etc. In chapter 5, to turn back to it, the one dedicated to trauma, there is a very dense analysis about the traumatic narratives, mostly closely focused on the case of Belene, the communist camp on the island in the river Danube, which is a major topoi in traumatic narratives for the memory of communism in Bulgaria. And Daniela Koleva traces and reconstructs this memory on both personal level and public level. Personal in terms of interventions and oral history interviews with different agents, participants in the maintenance and inhabiting and also victims of the camp, and public in terms of sites of memory and symbolic narrative tools and plots that are developed with in the effort of telling the story about this camp in a post-socialist term. I know that I'm already speaking too much about it, so I would not go very much into detail here, but I would like to raise again as a point that it's a synopsis of years of work on this particular case and a very careful and detailed reconstruction of the various aspects and sides of the memory of such a traumatic place, on the efforts of conveying traumatic memory across generations, across different participants, and trying ways to speak it out, regardless or despite the constraints coming from shame or repressive memories and compulsion and limitation of not being able to speak about such terrible experiences in the past. And here again, also raised in the next chapter, the last one on nostalgia, but here again, there is a major effort and very successful one on behalf of the author, reaching out from the policies of suffering and policies of digging about the truth of such a camp, reaching at the policies of compassion and conveying the message and these efforts of both the local community and Bulgarian society at large, conveying the message of compassion to the victims, despite all the constraints of remembering and talking about. In the chapter about nostalgia, we have a completely different story addressed, or set of stories addressing the perception and the reaching out at the communist period from the perspective of everyday life and cases of fun and enjoyment and social care and medical care and issues about security and solidarity during the communist years, and all these from the angle of the post-socialist situation, where there is a widely shared by many citizens view of lost values and disappointed, crushed illusions and disappointments after the end of the communist regime. So this is a chapter very much again reaching out at the changes of the challenges of the post-communist transition and how these changes sometimes even unwillingly, in many cases even without a preliminary plan, resulting paradoxically into a nostalgic revisiting of the past. And here Daniela Koleva speaks and discusses the possibilities about a nostalgic generation with a relationship to this accumulation of narratives and returns about the communist years from the perspective of longing about and lost worlds in the past that would not be able to return yet again. And to counteract this nostalgic rigor, she puts on discussion also the point of normality or abnormality of the post-communist nostalgia, and how valid it might be when positioned with all these stories discussed of trauma and repression that were discussed in the pages of the book before that. The conclusion of the book I would just, it's a question, and I would not like to retell this in detail the answers and possible grasps of this question, but it is a question about the hope about memory. Is there literally? It's a question of, is there hope for memory? And this open question is one thing that I would really like very much that Danielle herself to take the point to discuss. Without taking too much time, let me just pose on my side 2 or 3 questions, which are, in my view, are very crucial for the how to say, deciphering further some of the intellectual challenges that the book poses us to. In the first part of the book, or it's the second chapter, I think, Daniela Koleva puts a question about the relationship between the politics of acknowledgement and those of retribution. And I would really like to, Daniela, if you wish, and if you can give a bit more to the audience, some points relate, how to say, putting on discussion this relationship between acknowledgement and retribution. We know that both of these sides have not been to the extent necessary and will hardly ever be, will reach fulfillment in any of the post-socialist societies. And you very legitimately claim that retribution is by no means cannot be considered panacea for the traumas and the suffering of those periods, but is acknowledgement only such a remedy for the suffering of the past, and where actually the limits of these two categories. One of the major challenges, and here I go into my second question, one of the major challenges that Daniela puts in the first part of the book is about the creation and the possibilities of a common European memory. And Daniela, you discuss about the memory activists from the post-communist countries who insist on having such common European memory, where communism, the memory of communism should have its rightful place. But you also say that European memory has a very high normative potential. And could you a bit more discuss about this normative potential, and also raise also discuss or comment the limits of comparison? In your book, you constantly play with so rich comparisons with the cases of other Eastern European countries. So we can see a panorama of the developments in many of the countries of Eastern Europe. But what are the limits of comparison, and how many of these cases, they're so, they go in so different lines, many of these cases of Eastern European countries. Can we, when we speak about the limits of comparison, can we relate it also to the limits of representation? And how can we address here the issue of fragmentation of memory over time, and which is valid all over in Eastern Europe? And we have more and more vanishing grounds of comparison between different Eastern European countries in some years, already in some case, but within several years, probably they might be completely incomparable in terms of the policies they have undertaken to this period. And lastly, as a question, I have several more, but just not to occupy all the time, about the archival revolution and the establishment of the facts. This establishment was crucial for the transition period. But how does this affect the function of memory over time? How long can we rely on the effect of establishing facts when facts, many of those, most of those are already so pretty well documented and established, and still, despite this, they are running, forking paths of memory about this and lack of, lack of unity or lack of social public consensus about this period. Are we still, from the point of this case of establishing the facts and the constant revisit of the documentary and event basis of this period, are we still in transition? And how long can this transition period last, in both in terms of efforts and in terms of memory results? Well, I'm really sorry for taking so long, but as you see, and as I said, it's impossible to put things in a nutshell. Saying this and keeping my position for several small more questions, let me ask Daniela to take up the floor.
Okay, thank you very much, Nikki. Thank you. I'm so glad that that Nikolai Vukov presented my book. I don't remember how long we have known each other. Seems eternally, and we have been friends, and we have been working together or in parallel on similar projects, and from time to time on the same projects. And Nikolai's work is also cited and referred to at length in my book, especially his work on memories, that is memories in the public space, that is monuments. So it was really very interesting to see, to listen to you, Nikki, and to see your highlights, your accents, and listening to you, I was thinking that there is something autobiographical in this book. It's not about me. The book is not about me, but I just realized that the second half of my life so far has been working to and walking to this book. And perhaps the first half of my life has made this walking and this working possible. I mean that it is triggered by my own life experience, a considerable part of which was under the communist regime and seeing it collapse in the 90s. And it is also triggered by questions and queries and issues and debates with my friends and my colleagues and my parents. So it's in this sense, it is, I must say, it has been impossible to take an outside position or a position from above, which somehow oversees the whole field being outside of it, or what Mikhail Bakhtin called вненаходимость, being outside or outsidedness, whatever. So I am part of this force field. I am within, or have been within this force field of controversies, mnemonic, but not only mnemonic controversies related to this period of time. And the first impression, or the first highlight, is that in the field of memory, or the field of memory is not just what David Lowenthal called a foreign country. It's a couple of countries, or as I called it in the introduction, an archipelago of different islands or different mnemonic communities of memory, and there are no bridges between these islands. And this is the case in Bulgaria. It may not be completely the case in some other countries. It would be interesting to just to discuss on that. And then one's own past, the past or the memory of each of these communities is used as a weapon against someone else's past, against the past of another community. So that has been something that we have observed, or I have observed for quite some time. And actually the questions which form the basis of this study are about this. How is communism or socialism constructed as a public memory, as public recollection? How are these processes different or similar in different post-communist countries? So where are, as Nikki said, where are the limits of comparison? Then how do they influence one another? So are there some, obviously there are some transnational processes which, for example, the occurrences on one level or in one country influence the policies or the actions taken in another country or on another level. And then who is remembering, who is reminiscing, and what effect does memory have on the links between individuals and groups? And what is the relationship between that official memory, or the memory that we can call official, which is constructed by institutions and by state policies, for example, the laws on restitution or the laws on rehabilitation and so on, other elements of transitional justice in the strict sense of the word. And on the other hand, vernacular memory, the memory of communities and people in everyday life. Is there any relation between the two? How does the one influence the other? And then how does, as Nikki stressed, how does public and personal, what is the interplay between public and personal memories? I have come to memory studies from oral history or via oral history. So I have been working quite a lot for more than 20 years already with personal narratives, with what people say about their own lives. On the other hand, there is a public memory. There are memoryscapes in our cities. And it's interesting to see, and I have always been interested to see if there are links between the two. And yes, I'm sure there are, but it's not so simple to tease them out, to articulate how it happens. And then how does this transformation of public memory affect biographical recollection? How do communication strategies of any given group lead to the formation and articulation of shared memories? And this is why I have started with the level of official memory, so to say, or what is generally known as transitional justice. And transitional justice is, of course, something which looks like a simple description of a set of measures to cope with gross violations of human rights after a dictatorial regime, for example. And at first glance, it looks like a list. It looks like a simple description of what should be done. First of all, acknowledge the victims. The victims should get recognition. Then the victims, or those who suffered, should get some kind of compensation, if possible, to the extent that it's possible. Those who disappeared should be somehow acknowledged, and their fate should be somehow studied and made known. And their testimonies, the testimonies of those who suffered, should be made known. The society should engage with them. Then perpetrators should be punished. And then outside of the legal, of the justice, of the law, judiciary, and the justice system in the strict sense of the word, transitional justice, also the word justice does not boil down to laws and their enforcement. Somehow facts should be found and made known, and suffering should be commemorated. So all this looks like a kind of prescription, what can be done. And I'm saying should, because this description is actually prescription. It has a normative power. And if you observe the processes taking place, especially in the 90s, in the post-communist countries, what they do, what the post-communist transition does in the field of relating to the past is precisely this. And one of my theses in the book is that actually there's a template and there's a paradigm which was there already at hand. And that was the Holocaust template and the paradigm of the human rights paradigm, which put the emphasis, or called for putting the emphasis on human suffering, on the victims, and on their recognition. So I guess I'm coming to your first question about the relation between the politics of recognition, or the politics of acknowledgement of the suffering, and on the other hand, the politics of retribution, the punishment. And of course, the Holocaust template somehow directs and the paradigm of human rights directs the attention to the suffering, to empathizing with those who suffered, to the victims, or else the survivors, to those who were persecuted. And my participation in a cost action, which was about dissent in former communist countries, it's called NEP for dissent, NEP, the figure 4, and then dissent, made it possible to map out, to do some a kind of mapping of concepts in a few, I think 7 or 8 of these post-communist countries, with the help of my colleagues from this cost action, I was able to find out, to collect the concepts, the categories used in this legislation, in the transitional legislation, the laws on compensation of the victims, the laws on rehabilitation, and so on. And guess what? All these concepts were about politically repressed, victims of political repression, repressed persons, victims of Soviet repressions, victims of political repressions, again, condemned persons, politically persecuted persons, persons who were the subject of administrative measures, and so on. So they were all treated not in terms of active, but in passive terms. I probably cannot say passive actors, because if they are actors, they should be active, but persons who were imprisoned, deported, repressed, put in psychiatric hospitals. That is in terms of victimization. In only Lithuania and Poland, there were concepts of resistors, that is opponents to the regime, that is active concepts, resistors. And this, I think, is due to this human rights paradigm and this Holocaust template, which focuses on victimhood, on the victims. So this made, I guess, the politics of acknowledgement of those who suffered much not really easier, but something which was feasible. There were templates. It was somehow easier to figure out what to do, because there were examples already historically, but also around us. While the politics of retribution was much more difficult and much less successful, or if I dare say, not successful at all, at least in comparison with the expectations towards it. As a contemporary, I do remember for example, the trial against Todor Živkov, the Bulgarian Secretary General of the Bulgarian Communist Party, which the large publics, the large audiences termed kokoshkarsky. And I don't know, it's like chicken, how do I translate that into English? I don't know. It's like chicken plot trial or something like that. The idea was that he was tried for petty crime in comparison for what was expected, having in mind that he was more than 30 years at the head of the Bulgarian Communist Party and state. So there was indeed a bitter disappointment with the politics of retribution. Most of the trials either ended without convictions, without verdicts, or the convictions were much milder than was expected. So there was, I guess, a kind of a disappointment, a feeling of that there was a culture of impunity. The perpetrators of the communist regime escaped punishment, escaped retribution. But when I started to compare the situation in Bulgaria with that in the other post-communist country, it was not much different. Probably one exception is Romania in the recent years, when one commandant of a communist labor camp, forced labor camp, was finally convicted. And in most cases, the politics of retribution did not fulfill the expectations that this will be a kind of a revolutionary justice. And maybe that is not so, actually, that is not so bad, because otherwise, because actually the word of law was very important. And for example, some of the other countries, not in Bulgaria, but in some of these countries, the statutes of limitations were cancelled for such crimes. That did not happen in Bulgaria. But if we had the opposite, it might have been, as Adam Michnik said, an anti-communist dictatorship or an anti-communist apartheid. So at least in this, the post-communist transition did not follow the practices of the former regimes. But yes, indeed, the politics of acknowledgement or the politics of recognition was much more successful, shall I say, and much more easygoing. Certainly not easy, but it was something which could be done. There was experience, there were good practices, while the politics of retribution was a disappointment. And I guess that was not only the Bulgarian case. Now, speaking about the normative potential, I already highlighted the normative potential of this transitional justice. It looks like a description of measures, like a kind of a menu of measures. You can do this, you can do this, you can do this, but it does have a normative potential. It is somehow binding. And what about a common European memory? It's difficult to imagine what it would be like. You probably know German political scientist Klaus Leggevi, who outlined the 7 circles of European memory, which is somehow 7, let's say, European memory sites, lieux de mémoire européenne. That is memory sites which could be common for maybe not all, but most European countries. And of course, the center of this, the central circle, is of course the Holocaust. And immediately around it, or the next circle, is the Gulag or communism. Of course, to the east of where the Iron Curtain used to be, there is another disappointment, not only with the failures of the politics of retribution, and but also with the what is perceived as reluctance of the West to acknowledge the historical experiences of the East, and to acknowledge that the failure of the communist regime in Eastern Europe were actually the failure of the left idea. So in this sense, I guess we can talk about a kind of a maybe not archipelago, but a kind of regionalization of European memory. But if we look for common European memory, maybe these should not be common memory sites, such as Holocaust, communism, forced ethnic cleansing, wars, and so on. Probably, or possibly, these could be, in terms of the normative potential that Nikki mentioned, this could be some principles, some standards. And I guess, I think I can see, we already see such standards in my first example, the politics of recognition and the templates and the principles of these politics. Now about the limits of comparison. I have not thought about the limits. I was still at the, I was still at this enthusiastic period of starting with the assumption that Bulgaria was a country of a failed mnemonic transition. And then when I started to compare, it turned out that other countries have solved similar issues in similar ways. And especially in the politics of retribution, the successes were not many more. So I guess I am still in that phase, or in that position, where I tend to see the assets, the advantages of a comparison. And maybe you are right that maybe the dynamics, the historical dynamics in the, let's say, next decades or so, may make some kinds of comparisons less meaningful than others. But that's something to be seen. That's something to be seen. As far as the limits of representation, I think with those two chapters, one focused on traumatic memory and the other on nostalgic memory, I think I have somehow covered at least the two existing narratives about the past. And of course, there is another one. You mentioned the generational divisions in memory. And just today, I had a class with my first year bachelor students who were born in this century. And we talked about popular culture, and I gave some examples, and they knew about them. They knew about the Swiss group ABBA from the 70s, but their attitude towards that period is really different. And I think that we are witnessing the construction of another narrative by this next generation, and it's probably an ironic narrative. And I don't know if this is good or bad. On the one hand, probably it's, well, good or bad, probably it's natural. This is a different generation with their different experiences and so on. But to me, it seems like their irony and their amusement with the, with the everyday life, popular culture, youth cultures during communism, it seems to me kind of shallow, just not going deeper into the problems. So I don't know, probably the limits are the ones that we see and that we are ready to observe. And probably there are no absolute objective limits. And finally, the archival revolution and how does it affect the function of memory over time? this is actually a rephrasal of the question, is there hope for memory? Because on the one hand, it's somewhat disappointing that for the past 30 years, many studies have been done on that period, and many facts have been uncovered and interpreted and arranged into historical narratives. And somehow this does not affect this knowledge, this new knowledge, which is in many cases a very serious, deep, argumented knowledge. It does not deeply affect the memory. So it is not enough to know. Something more is needed. And what is it? And is there hope for it? I don't know. I guess that was mean. I was probably supposed to answer questions, and here I am asking more questions.
No, it's much more valuable to dig us into more and more questions so that our minds are to be further stimulated into the efforts of taking grasps of these extremely complex issues, which do not have an answer, one clear and straightforward answer, and that's really precious by itself. Dear colleagues, I'm taking up the floor now as a moderator, not as not that much as a discussant. Let me open the floor for interventions on behalf of the audience, for asking more questions for the stimulation of our minds. Are there colleagues?
Or maybe giving answers. Maybe someone
or maybe
has
giving answers.
First.
Yes, I'm not pessimistic about receiving answers, but still, I see a sign from Anna Lolwa. Please take the floor.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, both speakers. It was very interesting to follow what you were talking about. And my question is about methodology of how do you establish, how do you research those links between public memory and vernacular memory? How do you do that? If I understood that your sources are all oral history recollections, but then what's your explanatory framework? How do you find those links? Thank you.
Shall we gather some questions, or yes, maybe it's better. Lilia Topuzova, please.
Hi, thank you, Daniela. Thank you, Nikolai. So good to see everyone. I'll be brief because I have many questions and comments. But first, I want to congratulate Daniela on her tremendous book, and to say we're so excited to be reading it in English soon, hopefully. I have I would like, instead of a question, I would like for you to comment on something and to develop one of the arguments in the book, and it's maybe kind of riffing off of what Nikolai said earlier. While you're absolutely right that there is a normative framework that's set up by transitional justice initiatives and imposed by the state, I wanted to ask you about the kind of the absence of the state and the absence of state initiative and what that leads to, and maybe to think a little bit more of how you define the public within the Bulgarian context. Because when I think of the public, right, when I think of the public sphere, I think of what's visible in the public sphere, what's tangible. So, for instance, monuments, history books that are mandated by the Ministry of Education, but I also think of the less visible, right? And so what is invisible and what is visible by the state, and what happens in the complete absence. And to maybe think even beyond the Eastern European and even beyond the European context, that there's always going to be a gap, right, between public initiatives, state mandated commemorations, and then the private that gap always remains. But what perhaps is possible to bridge it within the Bulgarian context, and what is the role of the state within it is what I'm mostly interested in. Thank you. And I'm just gonna unmute myself and put my camera back on.
Thank you. Other questions? Not at this point. Daniela, please.
Okay. So what is the methodology? If I can come up with a neat methodology revealing or studying the links between public and private memory or public and personal memory, I'll write another book. For the moment, it's a kind of let's say, a kind of grounded theoretical approach, which is tied to the specific cases. For example, one of the case, the traumatic memory I study on the case of the memory of the communist forced labor camp on the island of Belene in the Danube. And in that particular case, my colleagues and I have done a lot of field work, starting with some 12 years ago, with narrative biographical interviews with elderly people from that small town who actually lived next door to the camp. And we asked them about their memories of the camp. Some of the men whom we interviewed, they even one worked as a telephone operator, another one worked in the administration. None of them worked as a militiaman, a policeman, or a guard. One worked as a tractor driver and so on, the so-called civil jobs, as they call them. And we asked them to tell us about their memories about the camp and what it was like living next door to the camp and so on. And in those narratives, when you read them, but also when you know the context of the 90s, we could find certain traces. For instance, there were references to memoirs and memories of former inmates. There were references to a very famous and very influential, I would say, a documentary by Atanas Kyriakov, which was released. It was shot at the first commemoration on the island in the summer of 1990. And then it was aired during the prime time of the Bulgarian national television, which at that moment in 91 was one of two channels. So if you watch TV, you watch this, obviously. And by the way, Lili Topuzova, who just took the floor a couple of minutes ago, she was she wrote the script of another documentary, The Problem of Mosquitoes and Other Stories, also about Belene. So she was there before me, and she made a wonderful work interviewing local people. And actually, you can find the traces of how those media publications, memoirs, documentaries, speeches, commemorations, how they frame the personal memory, the biographical memories. If I can give just one example, my own interview with the electrotechnician of the camp, he told me that he only worked as electrotechnician in the camp for a couple of years. And then he said, I quit because I couldn't stand it. And I asked him what was it that he couldn't stand? And then he told me a story which is a very famous one, and it is repeatedly being published or told in front of cameras by former inmates, how they had to run and they were chased by policemen, whip in hand, on horseback. And the electrotechnician said, when I saw this, I couldn't stand it anymore, and I said, I quit, and I quit. When I figured out the dates, however, it turned out that the moment he quit was 1958, when the camp was closed down. The camp was closed down, there was a prison, but they did not need so much staff. So part of those who worked there were obviously just fired because they were no longer needed. So was the electrotechnician, was he fired in this way, or was it his own decision to quit? I don't know, but and I cannot find out. But obviously the way he told it is made possible by the public memory, by the stories that he heard, shared, and watched being shared in the public space, in media, mostly in media and books and documentaries. And this is how, as you see, Anna, it's not a strict methodology. It's more like archival, like work in the archives. You go there, you browse, you read, and you find out something, or you may not find it. Maybe some more theoretically informed approaches are possible or will be possible, but my own approach has been this kind of grounded theoretical work. That is, I have worked with very close reading of the interviews and coding them, and then comparing these codes or even some words with what I read in what is known from the media and what can be seen in the memoirs and memories. I'm aware that this may not be a very satisfactory answer. And about the state, Lily, the absence of the state, here I'm happy to quote Nikolai Vukov, whose brilliant expression I have borrowed, and it is the politics of avoidance. And this is the policy of the Bulgarian state towards this past, the politics of avoidance. Bulgaria is probably the only post-communist country where the state, the Bulgarian state, to the best of my knowledge, and Nikki, correct me if you can, has not sponsored a single memorial or memorial sign to the memory of the victims of communism. All that can be seen around in the public spaces in Bulgaria has been the result of the initiative of non-governmental organizations, and of course, in many cases, in collaboration with local authorities. But the Bulgarian state has avoided the question, has avoided the problem, with only one exception, the Museum of Socialist Art, which has been heavily criticized for the lack of a conception. And anyway, the Museum of Socialist Art is part of the National Art Gallery. It's about art, it's not about history. It's not about the communist regime. So what is the result of this absence of the state, or of this politics of avoidance? I think the result is the archipelago, the proliferation of various cultures of memory, which don't even relate to each other. And the absence of a space, of a ground for dialogue between them. And Lily asked what could be a possible bridge. I don't see any bridge now. Maybe in the future. Well, there was a huge. Yes, Lily, you said what is the public memory, in addition to media, in addition to public space, the names of the streets, even the memorials, museums, and so on, and of course the textbooks. And only a couple of years ago, the period of communism was properly included in the school curriculum in history. So hopefully, studying the period of communism at school may bring about this possibility of a ground for future consensus. And of course, there are a few organizations, non-governmental. One of them is the Institute for the Study of the Recent Past, which Nikki mentioned at the beginning of his presentation, but also other organizations doing things related to the civil education and the education in history education about the communist past. So again, is there hope? There is hope. What else?
Thank you. I wanted also to add that indeed, in this respect, the state and the population at large, of course, generalizing, this is the point where they very often find such a common ground. The negative side, the avoidance of the topic, the avoidance of issues related to communism. And I wanted also to add that in some way I was a bit misleading, probably unintentionally, the audience, emphasizing the presence of oral history materials in the book. Of course, they are not the only, and they are major, but not an holding an exclusivist presence in the book. And there is also a very rich basis of archival materials, comparative look of documents, and legislative materials and documents from different countries. So the picture is not only within the how to say this, a field of power, of research power, which Daniela holds as oral historian, but in other fields where she also demonstrates a very strong power of interpretation and of dealing of such memories, such materials. So it's a very not only interdisciplinary in terms of topic and interdisciplinary in terms of approaches, but also very varied in terms of materials that are met together and discussed. We have a question, raised hand from Daria Gordeva, please.
Mm-hmm. Hello, and thank you. I had a comment and a question regarding this link between the personal stories, private memories, and the official narratives. I'm doing research on the GDR discourse in Germany after the German reunification, and what we see is that the way how people tell about their own past, especially in public, depends on the official discourse, on official narratives. So we have in Germany the dominant narrative which portrays the GDR as a dictatorship, as a state with no rule of law. And the fall of the Berlin Wall is celebrated as the end of years of repressions. And the people who were against the system, those who were against those in power, they are seen very positively, and they are celebrated as heroes fighting against the dictatorship and for freedom and democracy. And in contrary, those who had any connection to the system, especially to the East German secret police, to the Stasi, they are demonized and judged. And as a result, we see that people, especially in public, adapt their stories on this official discourse. So the voices of former opposition members or the voices of victims are very loud and very visible. And at the same time, the voices of the conformists, or even much more the former perpetrators, they avoid talking about it in public. So they don't want anyone to know that they supported this criminal system once in their past. So they see that this official discourse has a huge impact on what people tell about their own life in public, but also in private. And then also see that what ex-GDR citizens tell to me as a young Russian woman about their past differs from what they would tell to my professor, who is also coming from the GDR and who worked as a journalist and the GDR, who also supported this system. So I wanted to ask, how does it play any role in the Bulgarian context? And to what extent did you take into account the fact that memories are not static, and that what people may tell, that people might tell different stories to different people under different circumstances at different a different point of time? Thank you.
Thank you.
Very good comment and very good question. I think I now can answer better to Lily's question about what is the result of the absence of the state, based on what Daria commented on the GDR. Indeed, this discourse or this narrative of the GDR as, how it is called, Unrechtsstaat, is really very much accepted and very much taken for granted. But in Bulgaria, and maybe also elsewhere, but in Bulgaria, because of this politics of avoidance, this absent or this weak official narrative, there is no consensus on anything. So this archipelago, these controversial memory cultures are possible. And yes, you say that the voices of victims are heard quite well. I am not puzzled that perpetrators don't want to talk. They don't. In this small town of Belene, we tried to reach some of the former guards and talk to them. And the local people knew who they were, but they did not want to direct us to them, because obviously these were members of the local community. And we, coming from the Sofia University, were somehow outsiders, and nobody wanted to direct us or to tell us who those guards were. So they were, not only they were reluctant, but also their neighbors from the same community, from the same town, somehow guarded them. It was actually a rather ambivalent attitude. On the one hand, from the point of view of this memory of the perpetration, they were perpetrators. On the other hand, they were their neighbors and they lived together for decades. So that's probably understandable. And Okay, does it play a role that memories are not static? It certainly does. It certainly does. But it's difficult to estimate to what extent. For example, working with oral history, I had several conversation partners, several interviewees who told me about their traumatic experiences in the past, and then and I guess Valentin Voskresensky, if he's still here, he has much richer experience in this respect with traumatic memories. But those people sometimes would tell in the end of the interview, you know, I have never told this to anyone. Not even, they did not tell it to their children, because before they did not want to burden their children with family history which would not fit into that society. It would not fit into those children's or young people's identities, and it was just burden them with some family secrets which were not which were rather dangerous from that point of view. And in a couple of cases, my interviewee admitted that they had not told this part of the family story even to their children. So this is obviously one factor which influences that dynamics of memories. What is tellable and what is not tellable, what you can tell and what you better do not tell. But we had not in relation to the memory of communism, or in another project with my colleague who worked with Gabriele Rosenthal's method of biographical interviews. She interviewed a Turkish woman from a city in the northeast Bulgaria. So the interviewer was younger than me, about the age of that woman, but she was Bulgarian and the woman was Turkish. And then we had a colleague coming from Turkey, and she interviewed the same woman. So in one case, it was a Bulgarian woman interviewing her, and in the other case, it was a Turkish woman interviewing her, and the narrative was the same. It did not play any role. And how do we account for that? That probably people have some stories which we call sometimes anecdotal, which are rehearsed stories that they like to tell and that they have told many times. And in this case, this was the story of the forced assimilation of the Turks in Bulgaria in the mid-1980s, when they had to change their names. They had to change their Turkish names to Bulgarian names. And there were people, even older people, for instance, 70-year-old who was Hassan up to that point and had to be Christo from that point on, that is to have another name, which was of course certainly harmful and stupid, to say the least. And then a couple of years later, some 300,000 of these people left for Turkey. They were not directly expelled, but the atmosphere was such that they had to leave. So these are two events which have been told a lot on various levels, in public, in private, in the family groups, in the neighboring groups, in the villages, in the neighborhoods, I don't know. And I guess this was a story which was rehearsed. So she was already experienced in telling that kind of story. And that's what she did. But this is a hypothesis, I cannot prove it. On the other hand, yes, you are right that there's another example, an interview with a woman very soon after her divorce, and then 3 or 4 years later, when she had set a new life, she had new friends and so on, and was of course no longer traumatized. And these were different stories. Actually, she told the same events of her childhood, her adolescence, her adult life, but the stories were different in their messages. The meanings were different. Yeah, that's right. And does it play a role? In our case, I guess the public atmosphere, the public narratives did play a role in encouraging many people who had concealed facts of their biographies or of their family histories because they were not tellable in the past. They were encouraged to be more open and more honest. And also because we have this kind of nostalgic culture of memory, those who were nostalgic, they also were able to share their thoughts, because they had to, in each case, there was a collective narrative to which they could refer when telling about their lives. So my impression was that in most cases, they felt comfortably enough.
Thank you very much. As colleagues, we know very well that the sweetness of the work we are doing and the privilege of discussing, for example, oral history materials is that they give us a possibility for having longer and deeper conversations about the meanings and layers of things that are being shared. The materials, such materials, they open new stories, they open new levels of interpretation and discussion, and of course, raising again the issue of limits. They show us that we reach at a certain limit or certain limits of not only of understanding, but certain impossibility to uncover all the layers and all the density of meanings stored in such information. I promised that I would ask a question, but I realized that we are running out of time, and I would rephrase it as a comment just before giving the floor or returning back to Anna Topolska. It was a comment, it is a comment that related to the book and the book structure. As you remember, the book involves two separate kind of symmetrical parts, the last ones on trauma and nostalgia, and creates a dialogue in between these two pillars of approaching the past. There are many others, of course, but there is certainly one very important one, which is related partly with nostalgia, partly with trauma, but probably has a separate existence by itself. The one of which is related to, Daniela called it avoidance, but also one of allergy of the communist period and refusal to speak. So probably it's an expectation also that we and a wish also for Daniela to as next steps, follow-ups of her work, of extending this very critical point of relativizing and forgetting of the communist period, where revisiting back sometimes is related to refusal of how to say, reluctance of speaking about the past, and refusal of its revisiting. In the long term, in a decade or so, sadly, of course, we are more and more prone to encountering such positions, in parallel to fragmentations of memory and lack of consensus, lack of embraced state or public initiatives towards this past. But saying this, let me, as I have the position and the duty to do that, to give back the ball to Anna Topolska for concluding the session.
Thank you very much for this fascinating discussion. Thank you, Daniela and Nikolai, for accepting our invitation to be a part of our series, the PoSoCoMeS online seminar series. It was really fascinating. I would have also some questions, but probably we don't have more time today. So in the future, I hope there will be more occasions to talk together. And thank you to the audience for coming and discussing the topic. Also, I would like to invite everyone who has ideas for future seminars to contact us. And thank you very much. See you at the next seminar next month on the first Monday of the month. And if my colleagues from the seminar team have something to add, and Maria Anastasia, please. Maria, maybe you can talk about the next seminar.
Next seminar, and I would kindly invite everyone to join us in February, on February 7th, and we will discuss the Russian language book, which is Everything is in the Past. It is edited volume, collected works from prominent Russian scholars about oral history, public history topics, and we will discuss the book with its editors, Vera Dubina and Andrei Zavadsky, and you may be aware of their works. And also the discussant will be Ivan Kurilo, so please come and join us in February. Thank you, Anna.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you and goodbye. Yes.
Bye.